Maryland. He is the ranking member on the Foreign Relations Committee. It's nice to have you here, Senator, and we've learned the president will talk about what happened in Charlottesville today. Unclear, though, if he will denounce the racists, the neo-Nazis, the KKK, the white supremacists by name. What is your response to what the president has chosen to say and to not say thus far?
Well, Poppy, first, it's good to be with you. The president has to be clear. This is about moral clarity. What happened in Virginia was a tragedy. It was an act of terror by white supremacists, and he needs to be very specific about those responsible for that tragedy.
So if he does that today, Senator, is it enough, right? Because the question becomes the measure of the man, the president who represents this country to the world, and did he mean what he said at the right away, or what he later says after this condemnation from members of both parties?
Well, there's no question it was a missed opportunity by the president, and his reactions have been, I think, very problematic many times. The things that he does not say or the things that he leaves off the table. Look, the President of the United States needs to be very, very clear about how we will not tolerate white supremacists or the KKK or neo-Nazis. These are hate groups, and he's got to be clear about that. And yes, now if he changes, that's fine. At least he's made it clear. But it was a missed opportunity, and we see this happening way too often with President Trump.
You know who's praising him, and he knows this stuff. He reads Twitter all the time, and he sees these statements. You have this neo-Nazi website, the Daily Stormer, saying that his comments were good. He said he loves us all. He refused to answer a question about white nationalists supporting him. No condemnations at all. When asked to condemn, he just walked out of the room. Really good, really good. God bless him. That's from a neo-Nazi website praising the president.
Yeah. You know, you can't help what other people will say or extremists say, but the president needs to separate himself from these groups, and he missed that opportunity. So he's got to be very, very clear about who is responsible for the tragedy in Virginia. Our hearts go out to the families that were victimized by this act of terror. But he's got to call what it is, and he missed that opportunity. So moving forward, I would hope that the president would be much more sensitive to these types of issues and show leadership. But I must tell you, I have not seen that at all. Didn't see it during the campaign, has not seen it during his first months as president. This clarity about our values in this country, and that's disturbing. This country's strength is in our diversity, and he has certainly distanced himself from the traditional values of America.
Do you believe that this is at all being pushed as well, not to absolve the president of any responsibility, but do you believe there are those around him that are in his ear pushing this? You know, you had former White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci yesterday in an interview calling this Bannon-Bart stuff has to go. And then you have Sebastian Gorka, an advisor to the president, who said this in an earlier interview this month.
It's this constant, oh, it's the white man, it's the white supremacist, that's the problem. No, it isn't, Maggie Haberman. Go to Sinjar, go to the Middle East and tell me what the real problem is today. Go to Manchester.
Are there people around the president, close to the president, making this increasingly problematic?
You know, the president's responsible for the policies, development of the administration, and his policies on immigration, his policies on civil rights, his policy as it relates to these acts of violence show his lack of commitment to the values of America, and that is extremely disturbing. I don't blame it the people that are around him. The president's made these judgments.
His lack of commitment to the values of America. Just before we go, Senator, just as an American citizen, how do you feel this Monday morning?
Well, first of all, I'm saddened by what happened in Virginia. This is a tragic moment for our country where we see the acting out of violence. I want to see our leaders speak out very clearly and strongly against this form of hate and be willing to identify those responsible and take action to prevent this from happening and make it clear that this is not acceptable in this country. It's not about political support of any one group. It's about what this country stands for. And the people who are our elected leaders, the President of the United States, has to be very clear about standing up against this type of hatred.
We'll see if he does that. today. Thank you very much, Senator Cardin. We appreciate your time this morning.
Thank you.
Chris.
All right, so you heard from a Democrat senator there. What do members of the president's own party want to hear from him today? Do they think it's too little, too late? Republican Senator Todd Young joins us next.
Choose to go.
CNN has learned that President Trump is expected to address the deadly violence in Charlottesville today. So far, the president has not denounced white supremacists, but he did campaign on calling out terrorists by name. So why isn't he doing it now? Joining us now is Republican Senator Todd Young of Indiana. He's on the Foreign Relations Committee and served as a Marine Corps intelligence officer. It's good to have you on the show, sir.
Chris, thanks so much for having me this morning.
So we have one threat at home. We have another threat abroad in the form of North Korea. Let's discuss them both. What do you want to hear from the president today about Charlottesville and the people who were involved there among those white supremacists?
Well, Chris, thanks for covering this Charlottesville tragedy. Let me begin by offering my condolences and prayers to the families of the young lady who lost her life and was engaged in peaceful civil disobedience assembly, and the two officers in blue who are brave and trying to protect all those assembled. Listen, I can speak for myself here and say that such hatred, such bigotry, such evil, which was exhibited by these white supremacist groups, it's not only un-American, it is anti-American. It grates against all that we stand for as a people. We are a pluralistic country, and we need to celebrate our diversity, which does make us stronger. And I want to be unambiguous about that. And moving forward, I think all of us, from the local level on up, need to continue to speak out against such senseless acts of violence.
Should the president speak out today, or do you think it's too late?
You know, the president has spoken, and I'm not going to get into the business of trying to understand his statements. Certainly,
even when it's about something like this. I mean, this isn't about job numbers or about Kim Jong-un and who's the bigger tough guy. You know, there we get what the president can sometimes do stylistically, and whether you like it or not is subjective. This really isn't subjective. This is about calling out hate in America. There is no equivalence between the people who were down there protesting, you know, in favor of hate and against hate. The president seemed to not recognize that. We don't know why, but it's not something that should just be dismissed as style.
Well, I share your conviction, your sentiment, and frankly, the sentiment that I've heard from Hoosiers that I represent. This is hateful. There's no place for this sort of action, this violence, and this sentiment in America. And I'll be unambiguous about that. I represent all Hoosiers, and they sent me to Washington, D.C. to represent them on the issues most important to them. One of them is making sure that everyone feels respected and represented in this country, and I will forcefully advocate on their behalf on important issues from their domestic security to national security.
Well, Senator, what you say about Charlottesville is not being called into question, so the Hoosiers should feel good in terms of what they wanted from you on that. What the president says, we'll have to wait and see. He certainly has a situation to make up for. So let's move now to North Korea. We hear that Dunford is pushing for diplomacy. There is this rhetorical imbalance between, well, all military options are on the table, but the secretaries of state, secretaries of defense are saying, no, 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 diplomacy is where we want to go. We don't want regime change. We're not looking for war. How do you see this?
So the two are actually quite compatible, and they're not only compatible, it's necessary that the two coexist. That is, we need to have a credible threat, a military force on one hand, and then exercise vigorous diplomacy on the other. Sanctions are very important. In fact, I'm very proud of Secretary Tillerson and Ambassador Haley, who just got through the most robust sanctions regime, certainly in my lifetime, against the North Koreans. But a sanctions regime, which can be further ratcheted up, must be complemented with a credible threat of military force. So it's important that moving forward, General Dunford and the rest of our military continue to increase not just our readiness through further military exercises off the South Korean peninsula and within the peninsula itself and surrounding areas, but also by moving other military hardware into the area. That includes our special operators, that includes our anti-missile defense. There are even some conservative elements of the South Korean government calling for the redeployment of tactical nuclear weapons into South Korea. They were removed, as you may recall, back in the 90s. All of these things will send a message together that the pressure campaign is ramping up and hopefully bring this totalitarian, monstrous dictator, Kim Jong-un, to the table so that we can peacefully resolve this situation.
I appreciate the explanation on this issue. It's complex, but it matters to the American people. We will stay on it. As there are more developments, Senator, please come back and help explain them to the American people here on New Day. And thank you for calling out hate for what it is in Charlottesville. Thank you, sir.
Thanks so much, Chris.
All right. Now, tomorrow on New Day, we're supposed to have former White House Communications Director Anthony Scaramucci on the show to get his take on what is this now growing question of who told the president. Was this about him or people around him telling him not to mention the KKK in Charlottesville?
Looking forward to that. Meantime, some breaking news. A massacre unfolding in West Africa. Attackers taking over a restaurant. It's popular with tourists. The breaking details on this overnight. Next.
Thanks for having us here. What I'll say to you is this. I'll go with an example. You know, you come into your home as a father and you see 3 kids fighting. The first thing you're going to do is stop the fighting. The second thing you're going to do is condemn the fighting. And then the third thing you're going to do is find out, get to the bottom of what happened. That's the same thing here that the president did. He disavowed any bigotry, hate of all kinds, any kind of extremism, after the police, of course, broke all this up. And then the third thing he did was say, look, I'm going to send Jeff Sessions down here to investigate. He's done what a leader is supposed to do. We know that many of these extremists, whether on the left or whether they're on the right, they are media monsters. And what do you do to a monster? You starve it. You don't feed it. And so I think that the president has shown great leadership in showing that he's not going to let anybody on the left who's a radical extremist tell him what to do, nor is he going to let anybody on the right who's extremist determine how he's going to lead. Our president he basically got a situation where there's been so much division in the nation, and him blanketly disavowing all bigotry and hatred, I believe, is the best thing that he could have done for this nation.
Professor?
Well, let me say this. First of all, let's shift the analogy because your metaphor is insufficient. Let's talk about a burning house. You come to the house. One person is an arson trying to start the fire. Another is a fireman trying to put it out. What Trump did was essentially reinforce the status quo where the arson is really firebombing the house, and another group of people are trying to put that fire out. Number 2, Martin Luther King Jr. was called an extremist by a group of Alabama clergymen that led him to write his famous letter from a Birmingham jail. He said, at first I was disturbed to be categorized as an extremist. He said, it doesn't matter if you're characterized as an extremist, it's what you're an extremist for. He said Abraham Lincoln was an extremist for justice. He said Martin Luther was the same. John Bunyan in his jail was the same. Amos was an extremist for justice. So if you're an extremist for justice, that's fine. If you're an extremist against justice, if you're a white supremacist, there is no such thing as a false equivalency between Black Lives Matter, which grew out of the movement to repudiate the acceptance of the fact that black lives did not matter and that black kids were being killed and people were being killed in the street, versus white supremacists whose idea is to subvert and undermine the very patriotism that this country supposedly rests on. So this notion that the president has to come and then adjudicate between competing claims, Black Lives Matter on the one hand and on the other hand white supremacists, is nonsense. The reality is either you are a part and parcel of an American society that reinforces the value of justice and democracy, or you're not. White supremacists are in league with those who would undermine the capacity of this country to fully grasp hold of that. So this false equivalency is part of the problem, and Donald Trump, unless he comes out to explicitly articulate his resistance, is reinforcing the value of white supremacy in our own time.
Brunel.
If I may respond, I'll tell you this. I know one group followed the law. and got a permit to go down there and to protest. And that is the white nationalist group. You don't have to love or like anything they espouse. No, I don't. I'm sure you don't. But the thing about it is they did follow our law and got a permit. It was Antifa and these other extremist groups that came in protesting that did not have a permit. And another thing that was an issue here, there was not sufficient police presence there. You've got white nationalists there, you've got Antifa and other extremist groups. There should have been a proper police presence there. I live in Chicago. People protest all the time. Our mayor makes sure that there are police officers and different people there to protect. So this is the issue. White supremacists, black nationalists, everybody has a right to peacefully protest. And when you go and you follow the law and you get your permit, you should be under proper protection and you should be able to exercise that free speech. These people, they went there to go and protest the fact that Robert Lee's statue was being taken down. They had a right to be there.
Right. Well, yes.
It was peaceful until Antifa arrived.
All right. Well, a couple of point clarifications. One.
So those are the facts.
Well, let me add to them. One is going there for the statue being brought down is one reason they were there, but clearly the agenda was far more than just that. And secondly, local police there found it to be an unlawful assembly. They may have filed a permit, but once the police were able to assess the facts on the ground of why they were really there and what they wanted to achieve, it was found to break the law there locally for what is allowed as lawful assembly, and that's why they wanted them to disperse. So those are facts as well in terms of who was there to do the right thing versus the wrong thing. Professor, the point about proper policing, that's a legitimate issue. We're going to take it up with the mayor from Charlottesville, but that's not really the context of this discussion. Brunel, what doesn't make sense here is the Nazis, the KKK, the white supremacists, they are about hate. That's what they're about. Yes. Why assume that there is some type of equality between them and people who are fighting against them in this country? Everybody in this conversation right now is targeted by these groups.
But people have the right to freedom of speech. They have the right to the freedom. Excuse me, sir.
One at a time. One at a time. One at a time. Brunel, quick response from you, and then final word to the professor.
You spoke last, Brunel.
All right, but hold on a second. Final quick word from Brunel, and then the professor. Brunel, go ahead.
Yes, I was taught to respect my elders, sir. What I will say is that they have the right to the freedom of speech, the freedom of assembly. Again, you don't have to like what somebody's espousing in order for their rights to be protected. We know that human liberties begin to fail when freedom of speech and freedom of assembly is taken away.
Fine.
And so I'm not here. I don't want anything to do with any white nationalists, for God's sakes. But what I'm telling you is, as a lawyer, we know in court all the time, you may end up representing someone you may not agree with, but that doesn't mean they don't have the right to assemble.
No, that's true. But nobody's arguing. Nobody's arguing what their right is. Just because they have a right doesn't make it right. And this is about moral leadership from the president. But Professor, final word to you.
Right. Yeah. This false equivalency that's been introduced this morning is part and parcel of the problem. Our other guests' viewpoint reinforces the status quo, which reinforces white supremacy. And your point is that, look, there is no false equivalency between those who are opposed to hate and those who will foment it. Those who are articulated conception of American democracy that is full and vibrant versus those who are narrow and pinched in their conception of what it is. That's why even a black person can reinforce white supremacist ideology while people who are white can undermine it. And what we have to understand, it's not about white versus black, it's about right versus wrong. And white supremacist ideology undercuts the value of American democracy for all of us. And unless the president stands up to suggest that, this notion that Black Lives Matter on the one hand and white supremacist groups on the other are equal is part and parcel of what we have to fight in this country. And until he says that, we will continue to have this problem in America of domestic terrorism.
All right. An ugly situation, to be sure.
On both sides is wrong. Extremism, it doesn't matter to
Martin Luther King Jr. said extremists for good, extremists for evil. Extremists for good, extremists for evil.
Brunel,
not evil on either side.
This is an ugly situation. It demands conversation, and I am happy that we were able to have some of it here this morning. Thank you to you both. All right? There is a lot of news to get after. The president is up and tweeting. He's going after people he thinks he needs to be criticized. Is it the neo-Nazis? No. Why not? Let's get after it.
This car just plowed into an enormous crowd of people.
People are concussed, people are bleeding everywhere.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides.
And I understand what he meant by both sides. America is being moved into chaos by people on both sides.
Both sides are not using ISIS tactics, mowing people down with cars in the streets of America.
The suspect appeared to be infatuated with Nazi propaganda even in high school.
We have no tolerance for hate and violence from white supremacists.
We need the president to determine in this country that this will not be accepted, period.
This is New Day with Chris Cuomo and Allison Camerata.
Good morning and welcome to your New Day. Allison is off. Poppy Harlow joins me. Thank you very much for that. President Trump refused to condemn hate groups by name, and that continues. He's up this morning, he's tweeting, but he's not talking about this. Republicans and Democrats are blasting the president's response to the deadly violence sparked by white supremacists in Virginia.
Now, the Vice President, Mike Pence, is defending the president while at the same time saying what the president seems incapable of saying, at least yet, singling out white supremacists, neo-Nazis, and the KKK by name. Meantime, the suspect accused of driving his car into that crowd and killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer will be arraigned this morning. We have it all covered. Let's begin, though, with CNN's Jeff Zeleny in Bridgewater, New Jersey, near where the president is. And you have some more breaking details on what the president plans to do next.
Good morning, Poppy. I do. President Trump is traveling to Washington a little bit later this morning for a brief visit, interrupting his working vacation here. But I am told by a White House official that the president is expecting to address this Charlottesville attack in some form. He's not planning on holding a press conference, as he has suggested he would late last week, but he is planning on addressing this. When I asked this official if he planned to condemn the white supremacists directly, they said it's his call.
We have no tolerance for hate and violence from white supremacists, neo-Nazis, or the KKK.
Vice President Mike Pence doing publicly what President Trump did not over the weekend, directly condemning white supremacists by name after the deadly violence in Charlottesville.
We condemn in the strongest possible terms this egregious display of hatred, bigotry, and violence on many sides. On many sides.
The vice president coming to the president's defense in the face of growing backlash over Mr. Trump's response.
President Trump clearly and unambiguously condemned the bigotry, violence, and hatred which took place. I take issue with the fact that many in the national media spend more time criticizing the president's words than they did criticizing those who perpetrated the violence to begin with.
The White House releasing a statement from an unnamed spokesperson Sunday, 36 hours after the protest began, insisting President Trump's comments decrying bigotry includes white supremacists, KKK, neo-Nazi, and all extremist groups. Top aides to the president also pushing back on the Sunday shows.
The president's been very clear. We cannot tolerate this kind of bigotry, this kind of hatred.
The president not only condemned the violence and stood up at a time and a moment when calm was necessary and didn't dignify the names of these groups and people, but rather addressed the fundamental issue.
President Trump ignored multiple questions from reporters after his statement on Saturday.
Mr. President, do you want the support of these white nationalist groups who say they support you, Mr. President?
Mr. President,
have you denounced them strongly enough?
A car-fighting group of people, would you call that terrorism, sir?
We just aren't seeing leadership from the White House.
The president's refusal to denounce the groups by name drawing fierce backlash from his own party.
And I would urge the president to dissuade them of the fact that he's sympathetic to their cause, because their cause is hate, it is un-American, they are domestic terrorists, and we need more from our president.
Call this white supremacism, this white nationalism evil, and let the country hear it, let the world hear it. It's something that needs to come from the Oval Office, and this White House needs to do it today.
So we will find out in a few hours if the president decides to address this directly from the Oval Office when he's back at the White House. Now, it's so interesting. We've seen the president be blunt and outspoken when he wants to be. But on Sunday, yesterday, was only the fourth day of his presidency, he did not tweet at all. He's tweeted 3 times this morning about a variety of topics. So far, this attack is not one of them. Poppy?
Not at all. It is confounding, to say the least. Jeff Zeleny, thank you very much. The Ohio man accused of plowing his car into that crowd of protesters, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer, will be arraigned in just a few hours. And this morning, we're learning more about him from a teacher who claims that he idolized Hitler, among other things. Kaylee Hartung is live in Charlottesville with more. And Kaylee, you were there through the protests. You've been covering this from the beginning. What more have you learned about this man?
Well, Poppy, James Alex Fields Jr. will be arraigned just a couple blocks from here at 10 a.m. this morning. We expect this hearing to be very brief. He is being held in the Charlottesville-Albemarle Regional Jail. He will appear in the courtroom only via a video teleconference. The initial charges against him will be read, which include 1 count of second-degree murder, among others. The DOJ and the FBI have also opened a civil rights investigation into that deadly vehicular assault, and investigators will be looking to learn more about Fields' past as they look for his motive. And while his mother said shortly after learning of the charges against her son that she'd never really discussed his political beliefs with him, we are learning from his high school social studies teacher that this is a young man who had very radical views on race, who idolized Hitler, was infatuated with studying Nazi history and that of World War II. And the U.S. Army confirms to our Pentagon reporter Barbara Starr that in August of 2015, Fields reported for basic training. He didn't meet training requirements and then left the service in December of that same year. We're also learning more about victim Heather Heyer, a 32-year-old woman from the Charlottesville area. There was a vigil planned in her honor last night, but it was canceled due to perceived threats. At it, mourners continue to lay flowers on the makeshift memorial at the site of that crash. She was a paralegal for a Charlottesville law firm. Her mother says she was someone always passionate about helping others.
It was important to her to speak up for people that she felt were not being heard, to speak up when injustices were happening. And she saw in the lives of many of her African American friends, particularly, and her gay friends, that equal rights were not being given.
And the law enforcement community also mourning the loss of 2 of their own. It was in a helicopter that crashed as it was surveying the violence in the area on Saturday. Now the barricades that were in this park over the weekend are gone. The streets are open. There's still a lot of healing to do in Charlottesville. Chris.
All right, Kaylee, thank you very much. Appreciate it. Joining us now is the mayor of Charlottesville, Michael Signer. Mr. Mayor, thank you for being with us this morning.
Hi, Chris.
So we hear that the barricades are down. What do you believe the security situation is in the city?
Well, I mean, let me just tell you about Charlottesville first. We are, still grieving. We spent the weekend doing that, but we're getting back to work now. This city is one of the most loving cities in the world, I think. We were recently ranked America's most charming city. This is a city whose spirit and whose culture of generosity is supported by this spirit of diversity and tolerance that we have here. We have a major office, the International Rescue Committee here, for instance. You've got several hundred political refugees from around the world who have settled here. We love them. They are our neighbors. They happen to mostly be Muslim. We've got a very large, historic African-American population here, and something the city convenes called the Dialogue on Race, where the city actually leads us to get together and talk about these challenging issues in our past. This city is also, because of those two things, our generosity and our diversity, we're one of the most successful cities in the country right now. We're AAA bond rated, lowest unemployment of any city in Virginia. We have the highest venture capital rate of any city in Virginia. We just had 50 biotech companies launch an organization here. My point in saying all this is that if they figured they had some city to intimidate away from progress, to intimidate away from the hard work on telling the truth about race in our history as a southern city, they picked the wrong city. I think if anything, we're going to come together, we're going to press the gas on all the values that have made us a success story, and I think that we're seeing that. As we speak, there were like 600 rallies last night around cities in Virginia in support of Charlottesville against this wave of hatred and intolerance and outright bigotry we saw this weekend. I mean, groups like Nazis and the KKK in our streets feeling comfortable to show their faces, that came to a head this weekend. I think the nation as one rose up and just turned the page on it, and it happened here in Charlottesville.
What do you make of the president this morning continuing to not address specifically who was there and what they did, calling out Nazis and white supremacists? Do you think he still needs to do that, or is the moment gone for him?
You know, I've already spent enough time talking about Donald Trump. He is our president with respect. But you know, I think it speaks for itself. He had his moment. I mean, these are times for leadership. He already seems thinking about working families and solutions, which I have to do all the time as the mayor of a city like this. Is just kind of, you know, put action on the table, get things done. He kind of had his opportunity and he whiffed, and I think that speaks for itself.
Let me ask you about something else while I have you here. The situation down there was anticipated to be one thing. The police assessed it as something else. And then it grew into the ugly conflagration that we saw down there. Do you believe that you had the resources in place to deal with that situation? Or do you believe you were playing catch-up from jump?
Well, let me tell you a couple things. For months, this was anticipated to be a very large gathering, and those numbers, those predictions kept on growing and growing and growing. We had on the ground here the largest deployment of law enforcement professionals in Virginia since 9/11. As I understood it, almost 1,000 officers were right here in the ground. We're a city of 50,000 people surrounded by a county of 120,000, so an area of a couple 100,000. Second thing is, because the numbers were looking like they were going to get so large and predictably so violent, so armed, our city manager made a decision last Monday, to move the rally to a much larger location where the level of policing could be easier to maintain. It was a park within city borders of about 100 acres where you could have had two separate groups, protesters, counter-protesters, a lot more speech, a lot lower likelihood of declaring unlawful assembly, which is happening, which happened. Unfortunately, this was very regrettable in my view. A federal judge at the 11th hour on Friday night, the late hours, 9 o'clock at night, about right before the day of the rally, prevented the city manager from moving the rally to what he thought was that much safer area where, all those hundreds of law enforcement could have had an easier time dealing with people who clearly, we now know, came here for violence, came here for incitement. So it was what it was. As it happened, they were forced to declare an unlawful assembly because there was so much violence before the rally even got started. Our job as a government is to set the conditions to prepare so that people can peaceably assemble, peaceably express themselves, and they didn't even allow that to happen for their own rally.
Well, Mr. Mayor, thank you for the perspective on that. It's one of the continuing questions. And as you start to see what often happens in situations like this, where people don't just condemn the hate, they counter it. As those examples come up in your community, let us know. We want to report that as part of the story as well. Thank you for joining us on the day.
I'll tell you a story right now. Yeah, okay. Well, that's where it's going to go.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Appreciate it.
And we'll have the mayor back to do just that. Our thanks to him. Let's bring in our panel, CNN political analyst John Avlon and Karin Demersion, and CNN political analyst Ron Brownstein. So we've just learned the breaking news from our Jeff Zeleny, John Avlon, that the president will speak about Charlottesville later today. Now the question becomes, if he does choose to condemn the racists, if he does choose to call out, like even his own vice president has and his daughter has, white supremacists, KKK, neo-Nazis, is it too late? Do you judge someone from what they say first?
Yeah, I'd say it's better late than never, but it doesn't erase the history. We're dealing with not only...
You heard the mayor just tell Chris he had his moment and he whiffed.
Yeah, and he did. There was a conscious emphasis to not call out neo-Nazis and the KKK, and instead to try to broaden the criticism with a moral equivalence that even neo-Nazi sites took as validation of their perspective. And there's a larger problem here, too, that I think the president needs to take ownership of as his position as if he wants to be a true leader of the nation rather than leader of a political faction. Normally, the way these things have worked is that we've seen a rise in militias when they've been Democratic presidents, particularly over the course of the last 30 years. We saw it under Clinton, under Obama. The Christian nationalist militia movement gets energy from Democrats when they feel in opposition. What's stunning about what's happening now, and I think particularly troubling, is that these numbers are rising now with a Republican president who some of them feel have empowered them. right? And you heard David Duke say it from the rally yesterday. It is never too late to condemn hate, but Trump and his administration are needing to do a lot of soul searching, because a couple of Band-Aid tweets aren't going to deal with the problem that they have empowered these folks, or are seen by these groups as to have empowered and given them license.
Karin Demergen, it would be interesting to hear the president take an opportunity to do a little bit of what John's suggesting there, maybe even saying why he didn't say it in the first place, maybe even owning a little bit of that. That is not what we have ever seen him do before. It is more likely that he will take a page out of what was given to the vice president, that he's going to attack us and attack everybody else who suggested he did something wrong.
Right. I mean, the president is not the best at apologizing and saying, I'm sorry that I, was not communicating properly or correctly, assuming that he actually is in agreement with everybody else in the GOP that's criticizing him, right? It would not be that hard to say, I'm sorry I didn't choose the right words. But he doesn't do that, as a matter of course. And so, and you've seen exactly that his surrogates have been pointing to the media. I mean, it's many people in his own party that have been calling him out with the strongest terms and saying, you need to name these people and say what they are. You need to name these groups. It's not doing anybody any favors to not say the words neo-Nazis or white supremacists. Please do. And so, I mean, if the president releases a statement where he does use those words, it means that he heard those criticisms. If he doesn't, it means that he's doubling down and making this more about him than the country, which is kind of the problem in the first place. I mean, there was a lot in that statement he made on Saturday that would have been completely laudable. It was just the context in which it was presented by adding that on many sides, and then the references to him and Barack Obama and everything else that kind of took it away from what the message could have been.
I do.
And if he had only then gone that one sentence further to say, no, these are the groups that are the problem.
You know, I do think, as Karin just brought up, Ron, what isn't getting as much attention, but is very important, is when he tried to, it seemed like, absolve himself of any blame when he said not Donald Trump, not Barack Obama, as if he didn't start his political life, if you will, years before the campaign on birtherism.
Sure. I mean, whatever he says now, and I think inevitably he will go further, he communicated exactly what he meant to communicate, and we can say that because he has done this before. This is exactly what he did around the David Duke issue the Sunday before the biggest concentration of Southern primaries during the Republican contest, where he sent the message by what he didn't say, and then only after the fact, after that message had been sent and received, did he kind of give in to the bipartisan condemnation and kind of mouth the words that everybody was demanding that he mouths. He may do the same thing again. By the way, what you heard from the mayor, I thought, was an incredibly precise encapsulation of the central fault line in American politics. We were talking in the last hour about whether the Trump vote was driven more by economic or demographic and racial unease. In fact, what you saw was a mayor talking about a community, a university town that is diverse, that prizes tolerance, and is also thriving economically with kind of a big biotech. He talked about the big biotech emergence. That is kind of what is happening in many urban centers. And then outside of that, you have large portions of the country that feel completely left out from both of those trends. And it is there that Trump drew his strongest support. And while there may be a very small percentage of people who align themselves with the views of the KKK or the Nazi Party, what you have seen is a reluctance on his part to isolate those groups, because there is a continuum of Americans who are uneasy about demographic change. And from the beginning, he has appealed most strongly to them.
Well, I got to tell you, just from where he grew up, which is the same place that I grew up, I can't believe that the President of the United States, Ron, can look at his Twitter feed this morning and look at the people who are supporting him and how they're supporting white supremacy and how they're supporting things that make, a mockery of what this country's about, and not come out, even if he was somewhat shamed into it, and saying these people need to stay away from me. They are not who I'm about. But we'll see. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Appreciate it. Calling for this to happen, for the president to come out. It's not just about the media. It's not about the left. It's not about the right. It's about a whole group coming at the president. We're going to talk to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle. They're going to talk about what is simply not okay in America. Next.
Aaron Burnett out front. Stories that matter.
You've got the money and you've got the passion, but how do you actually make a difference?
From the people making headlines.